Hi, everybody. Welcome to WACOS, the first in a series of webinars. In fact, at WACOS, we're running over the next couple of months. Really nice to have you all along. And of course, I'm starting our webinar acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people. I'm acknowledging that we're on their budja. Some people may be joining us from the lands of others First Nations peoples, and I also acknowledge them, acknowledging elders past, present and emerging, and that this land was never ceded and therefore is stolen land, and we have a lot of unfinished business. And for WACOS, part of addressing the unfinished business is we are strongly supporting the voice and urging everyone to look at the issues around the voice and to engage with the referendum process and support the voice, which is part of addressing that unfinished business. No one's pretending it's the answer, but it's a very key mechanism to addressing a lot of our unfinished business. Thank you for coming to the webinar, which is around and titled Communities Will Have Conflict, How Can We Lessen the Pain? And I'm sure many of you have experienced some of that conflict, and it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Katherine Sugars and Dr. Megan Paull along with us today. And I'll just give you a brief bio and then I'm going to hand over to Katherine and Megan. So Dr. Katherine Sugars, Katherine's work and volunteer experience in the not-for-profit sector is based on her commitment to community organising and to valuing the knowledge and agency of people in civil society. She teaches at Murdoch University's Business School and collaborates on her research in her role as Honorary Research Associate. Katherine also consults in the area of her doctoral research, the lived experience of schism in not-for-profit organisations, on understanding the social dynamics of group conflict. Her focus is building resilience to disruptions induced by or manifesting as leadership or power issues, identity transformation, fractionalism, fractionalisation, I beg your pardon, and conflict threatening relationships, group effectiveness, and potentially organisations. Dr. Megan Paull is working with and researching community organisations and has been for over 25 years. Her work with volunteering or involving organisations often includes dealing with tricky situations, and she runs interactive workshops on dealing with difficult volunteers and valuing volunteer managers. An active volunteer herself, Megan's approach is to draw on the experience in the room to create safe spaces for conversations and difficult topics, and to assist participants to develop strategies for managing their way through the challenges which emerge. Megan teaches and researches at Murdoch Business School in the area of not-for-profit management and leadership. Thank you for joining us. And I'm going to hand over to Katherine and Megan, but sorry, I deeply apologise. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rachel Seawin. I'm the Deputy CEO of WACOS. Apologies that I didn't do that to begin with. I'm now going to hand over to Katherine and Megan, and if providing Katherine and Megan are willing to, I'm hoping that we'll also have question and a discussion session afterwards. So hold on to your questions and we'll go to that after Katherine and Megan have spoken.
Thanks Rachel. How about if I share the screen, Megan, and you can introduce us.
Okay, just on this webinar. That's okay.
Thanks, Kath. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. My role, first of all, is to acknowledge that Murdoch University is situated on the lands of the Whadjuk and Bindjarab Noongar people, and to pay our respects to their enduring and dynamic culture and the leadership of Noongar elders past and present. It's become increasingly important for us to recognise that Murdoch is actually located on budja that's been a place of learning for a very long time, and I was actually able to join a Yes 23 event that was held in our new building on Saturday. The building is known as bulacatagen, which means lots of learning, which actually epitomizes that which Murdoch is trying to achieve. I'm going to hand over to Kath now, because I think probably the best way to start all of this is for her to tell us all about her research. Thanks, Kath.
Thank you. So, schism. When I first started my research, I had this picture of what schism was in my head based on my own personal experiences. And I found out that all schisms are different, but I'm going to tell you my story to start us off, see if it sounds familiar to you. So I was the coordinator of a small community school. I put my heart and soul into the role for about 10 years. Everything was going well. I was getting ready to hand over. Then a few people started to feel discontented, and that gossip started to turn to planning. Things were happening that were very strange. People acting in ways that were quite perplexing, surprising. My instincts kicked in. I knew there was danger, but it was hard to articulate what that was. And as the leader, it was inappropriate to share any of that. I felt that unconditional support that I'd always enjoyed start to slip. I started hearing about secret meetings that were going on. And all of a sudden, the contest became obvious, but it was shrouded in rationalizations about what the issue really was about, which it really wasn't. So the communication broke down. I lost trust. I felt isolated. And to be honest, I felt betrayed. And then factions started to solidify. Things escalated. Many points of no return were approached and passed by. There were coups at meetings. It put a strain on my relationship with my colleagues because I felt that they could have been more publicly supportive. That's a hurt that I carried. It took all my attention and all my emotional energy away from doing my actual job. So I was trying to do both at the same time. I had to decide at that point whether to stay and fight another fight, because obviously I'd had plenty of, struggles over principles and what should we do many times, but it was the first time it had been very personal. Everything came to a climax at a whole school meeting that I initiated. And even though that this was 15 years ago, I felt, I've got this vivid memory of that meeting, just sitting actually on the floor. And I don't know why I was sitting on the floor, but I was coughing and I was crying and I was miserable. And there's all those people voting on who was supporting me and who was supporting other people. It was awful. And in all of it, I had this sense of hopelessness because in my heart and in my mind, I was out of there. My heart wasn't in it anymore. So in the end, everything got shook up. We got a new parent committee, council. I stayed for the rest of the year as a parent, but I quit my job. But the three of the four families who I felt had initiated the discontent, they left because became very obvious at that meeting that they didn't have any support. So the support they had been building slipped away very quickly when everything came out in the open. But I couldn't stay. And the school is absolutely thriving now. And that often happens with a schism. The organisation gets a new lease of life. But what happens to the people is quite sad sometimes. I never recreated that connection I felt with my school. And most of the people I talked with in my research, they had not the same experience, not the same things happen, but the same feelings, the same personal experiences of feeling obsessed, of feeling overwhelmed, of feeling afraid, of betrayal, of confusion. And that I knew that there had to be some patterns in this that we could use in order to do this thing better. Like, why do we make such a mess of it? So I tried to figure out what the patterns were. One of the things that came up very strongly was that people didn't feel like they had any good options to take. There wasn't very many obvious steps that were going to work and weren't going to just go blow everything up in people's faces. So I kept coming back in all of the things that were coming out of the data. I just kept coming back to that thing of what's really valuable to people in the middle of a schism is more options, more good options for action, and a better idea of how other people are going to respond to that. And I feel like I'm sort of quietly proud of the research and what I've found, and I think that we can do this better. And the way that came about was through what I call an ontological shift in what I think a schism is. So after 4 years of struggling with how do I fit all this together, I had a bit of a breakthrough, and that was to question my basic assumptions about what a schism is. So this linear process model of schism, I was looking at the data, I was looking at what the participants are saying, I was looking at Brexit, actually, that's what was happening when I was in the middle of things. And I was thinking, this doesn't work. You know, how are all the people in Britain going to leave Britain? You know, 49% of them didn't like what happened, but they didn't leave. So this whole idea of a mass exit, it can't be what a schism is, because that was a schism. So I think what I came up with, what came out of what people were telling me, is that rather than a straight line where you start out united and you end up divided, that you have to fight your way backwards and forwards across, I think it doesn't really work like that. And it's not really what people did. What they did was they started at one, let's say united but heterogeneous place. And as you move on, as the things happen, as the points of no return or the triggers occur, the events occur, people do persist in trying to solve the problem and try to move into a better place for the group. So if we imagine ourselves, instead of trying to fight our way back to a united situation, think about how can we understand the situation we are in and move to a better, more preferred future. And just little steps at a time. Not this is going to solve the whole problem, because that comes up over and over again. This vote's going to solve everything. That meeting's going to solve everything. This idea is going to solve everything, but it never seems to happen. So even when people can get to that place of, well, that person's got to go, or those 3 people have to leave before we can resolve this, and that definitely happens, even then you still don't have to lose half your membership. There are many ways that you can get around losing big chunks of people, and yes, you might have to ask some people to leave. So in this way of looking at schism, rather than events or the circumstances determining the outcomes, we look at people's lived experience of those events and the way they make sense of those events and circumstances, and how they respond to those events and circumstances. That is what determines what happens, not the events themselves. So I came up with a new conception of schism. I call it a new definition, as a complex social construction identified by the presence of 4 elements. And these were the 4 things that were present in every single schism that I studied. Mass exit was not present in every one, nothing like leader change or change or this or that. None of those circumstantial things were common to all the schisms, but these 4 things were. And these are all social dynamics. So you've got worldview impingement, someone or everyone's view of the world or their identity or their imagined future for the organisation is threatened. You've got transformation. The change might be real. It might have happened already and you're feeling the ramifications. It might be something that some members of the group hope for but others don't want. And it could just be a perceived change, but there's change involved. You've got factionalisation. Everybody knows once you get to that us and them language, you've got factionalisation and things are getting a bit grim. And the last thing is contest. People contest. They don't cooperate to solve problems. They contest over what should happen, how we should decide what happens, and most of all, people in schism contest for power. And so this is what I call my definition of schism. That is, if these four elements are all present in your social dynamics, you are by definition in a schism. The advantages of this new definition, you can, a model of definition that ends in a mass exit and relies on a process of events, you can only really define it when it's all over, when it's all happened. But with this definition, you can look at it and say, are we split? Are people afraid of change? Are we contesting instead of cooperating? And then you can apply your knowledge about what to do in schism during the schism, which is much more useful than afterwards. It also reminds us that avoiding conflict at all costs is not something that we always do. In fact, there's a number of things that are more important than not having conflict. And the future of the organisation is a very common one I found with the people that I interviewed. One of my participants referred to their schism as the war that had to be had. So avoiding conflict or minimising conflict is not always the goal of everyone in the organisation. And certainly for activists, it's not. We want to bring these things out into the open. What this way of looking at schism does is focus on the experiences that people are having and the outcomes that are going on, multiple outcomes. Given the current situation, what can we hope for? Given the current situation, how can we make things better? And best of all, in my mind, it gives you a really systematic and thorough way to go through many different options that you have and how you increase control over what happens when you do those things is by understanding the social dynamics that exist and not pretending that things are as we assume that they're going to be when we write our conflict resolution procedures, which in a non-profit organisation, we think we're going to cooperate, we're going to be honest, we're going to talk to each other, we're going to follow the process, we're going to behave according to the values of the organisation. And these things just aren't real in a schism. So there were three more themes that emerged from the data that strongly influenced the dynamics. One was that people were acting in a way that indicated that there were human needs, basic human needs that were not being met or that felt threatened. And there were things around identity, safety, predictability, self-efficacy, and things like that. Secondly, those contests over the balance of power drove the schism very strongly. And the last factor that was more of a mitigating factor or a regulating factor was the capacity of the group to enact leadership. And that could be the leaders themselves or the structures that are in place or the leadership of the group as a whole. Because a lot of the schisms involved leadership change or weak leadership or loss of a founder, no leader at all, or turnover of leaders. So leadership was a really major thing. So skipping over 6 years of research, blood, sweat and tears, heart and soul, putting everything together. This is my theory of what schism is and how we can act to just do it better, I think. So it has been proposed in the past, and it persists, this idea that schism is a failure of the group to resolve conflict. Now, schism is a way to resolve conflict. It might be a bit messy, but it is a way to resolve conflict. I don't see it as a failure. I see it as courage. I see that when we organise ourselves as an organisation, we invest ourselves, our identities into the organisation, we share power with others, we take a risk that we're going to have a schism. And I think it's courageous. And I think that one of the tenets of community organising is this idea of sharing power together to do something that we want to do together. And I don't think we should see it as failure. However, there are consequences for the organisation in terms of credibility, loss of focus on mission, and the loss of members, so it can be financial. And of course, for the people, my participants describe their experiences as crushing, miserable, a betrayal, not only of friendships, but of non-profit values. And Meredith here, she called it soul destroying, what happened in her organisation. And experiences like this take a long time to recover from, and they diminish the sector as a whole. So let's get real. Over thousands of years, we have not managed to stop having schisms as a human race. So I'm pretty sure we're going to keep having them for the foreseeable future. But what I think we should try and do is get better at it. And that's basically the message of my my thesis. And I think we can get better at it. So something I haven't touched on here is the role of what my participants described as narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths. Of course, that's from their point of view, which may not be an objective assessment for me. But I'm going to hand over to Megan now, and she is going to talk to you about sticky situations and difficult volunteers.
Thanks, Kath. So the reason that we're doing this together is because my work over many years has been about volunteers and volunteer management, including sticky situations and difficult volunteers. Sometimes what's going on isn't about schism. Sometimes it's about how we view the behaviour of others, and sometimes it's about expectations. So Kat's going to be turning over the slides for me because we figured that it would be a little bit easier to do that than change over who's in control. So in terms of difficult volunteers, once again, that's in the eyes of the beholder, but the types of difficulty can be as simple as someone who actually delights in or chooses to set off an explosion in the organisation and create problems. Or it can be somebody who decides that they're going to have a tantrum because they can't get their own way. But there can also be other things like you don't hear from someone, even though they're supposed to have completed something or done something, or that they take risks that you don't necessarily want or need them to take. So what we call difficult covers a whole range of behaviours. The situation there is that we have lots of options about what we can do, from telling them what to do and, the directional type of management, to giving them a hand up, to actually talking to them and getting a clear understanding of how their expectations and your expectations fit together, to having a round table and a discussion about what's going on and what needs to occur, or perhaps hearing what you might need to do. Sometimes it can be about helping them to balance what it is that they want against what the organisation needs. And sometimes it can actually be about an agreement to go separate ways, which of course could be seen as a form of schism, except that if it hasn't involved a great deal of conflict, it is just a mutual parting of the ways, then that's a slightly different outcome. Thanks, Kath. So one of the things we know is that when an organisation is under pressure from all sorts of things, including, for example, competitive tendering for funding, or changes that are associated with the government changing the rules, or COVID, or whatever else it is, that the things that are not necessarily visible from day to day become visible. The managerial styles, the decision-making modes, people's emotions and so on become exposed by the fact that these organisational pressures are there. So sometimes it's actually the case that it's not about what's going on inside the organisation necessarily, it's what the organisation is doing in response to these outside pressures. Although sometimes those pressures are associated with, for example, a change of leader or a change of CEO. Thanks, Kath. There's also a whole range of uncomfortable bits that could be going on that we need to stop and think about our own behaviour. One of these is I have referred to as purple circles. Now, the expression purple circles actually comes from quite some time ago, and it's a British term from what I understand, where the clerical advisors to the king wore purple, and the reason they wore purple is because the dye to make their garments purple was very, very expensive. But the expression we use now is about the group that gets together to chat with the leaders who keep others out, who don't necessarily share information. And sometimes this can be something that emerges or forms by accident rather than by design, where actually groups of people get together before the meeting to discuss what's going to happen in the meeting so the meeting can go smoothly. But what that means is that sometimes the opinions of newcomers and outsiders isn't necessarily heard. There's also founders syndrome. The people that set up an organisation sometimes have their idea about how things should be done and how things should be run. And then circumstances change and the organisation needs to change, but the founders or those who set up that project or that policy are reluctant to let it go and don't want things to change. And sometimes you could be guilty of that, even if you're not necessarily aware of it, in the same way as you might be guilty of being part of a purple circle. There's a whole range of IST behaviours that I'm sure most of you are familiar with: ageist, racist, sexist, whatever it is. Sometimes it can be elitist behaviours, where your understanding of people's levels of education and how they can contribute go together, when in fact people's levels of education shouldn't have any impact on how well they can or can't contribute. And sometimes we might actually think that what's happening is what we might call robust management, when in fact the people that are on the receiving end of it perceive it as bullying. So there are times when in fact what's going on can be something that we are contributing to, even though that's not necessarily our intention. Thanks, Kath. So in terms of volunteers, and volunteers has been the main focus of my research, the things that we know keep volunteers attached to the organisation are many. The research onto motivation to volunteer is huge. And so I just wanted to pick out a couple of things to relate to you. The first is that what you're asking for is inputs of time and effort from people. And what will keep people coming back is where they feel respected for what they contribute and what they do. They get some level of recognition, and that recognition can be as simple as thank you. It doesn't have to be great big ceremony. And in fact, some volunteers will choose to leave an organisation that's spending too much money on recognition and not enough on the clients. And the other thing that keeps volunteers attached is their sense of well-being. Now, their sense of well-being can be associated with how they feel like they are benefiting from their relationship with the organisation. They might get a sense of satisfaction out of what they do. And their sense of well-being may be that they're doing some sort of volunteering that is actually hard and emotionally draining, but they believe what they're contributing is valuable. So the fact that they are contributing as a volunteer makes them feel good about themselves, even though there might be some negative sides to it. The other thing is that we know that people stay attached to the organisation in relation to the people, the friends that they've made, the people that they're connected to, the clients they've got to know. Sometimes it can be associated with the mission. They fervently believe in what it is that the organisation is trying to achieve, even when what's happening on the day-to-day in the organisation isn't quite going the way they would like. They can see what the organisation is trying to do, so they'll stay attached. And sometimes it can be the task. They absolutely love whatever it is that they're doing, So even when the people around them change or they're not 100% committed to the mission, they absolutely love what it is that they do. And of course, a combination of all of those things can actually be part of the reason that they are feel like they're getting the reward for what they're doing, and therefore their well-being, they're getting recognised and they're getting the respect. All of these things come together to keep people attached to the organisation. Thanks, Kath. So one of the things that I keep coming back to when I talk with organisations about managing difficult, and I put those in quote marks, volunteers, is that there comes a time when you do have to have the difficult conversation. I'll come to who should do this shortly, but if you're the person that has to have that conversation, there's a whole lot of things that need to happen, including what is the evidence? On whose say-so are you making this judgment? What policies do you have in place in the organisation? And even small, all-volunteer organisations with nothing else other than a constitution have some level of guidance about what the organisation policies are. You need to plan what you're going to say, and you need to have thought about what the potential consequences are. So planning what to say might mean that you think about, well, if this was said to me, how would I react? And of course, people's reactions are not necessarily something that you can predict, but you need to be mindful of what those potential consequences might be. In that conversation, you have to focus on the behaviour, not the person. It is this that we're talking about, not you are a terrible person or you are a difficult volunteer. And you also need to pay them the respect of listening to the response, because sometimes what you have interpreted in a particular way is not necessarily what their intent was or what they thought was going to happen. The other thing is that you need to, with that person, if they're willing, and sometimes you need to leave a little bit of a gap in time, plan what's going to happen next together and set time or an opportunity for a follow-up. You don't always get this opportunity if the person responds badly, but even following up a couple of days later to say, okay, now you've had time to think about it, is there something we can do, might be a worthwhile thing to do. Now, the who should do this is interesting because in some organisations there's clearly a volunteer manager, someone who can take on this responsibility, although sometimes if the volunteer manager is involved in whatever it is that's causing the tension, then it might need to be a different person. But in an all-volunteer setting, sometimes it might be the president, sometimes it might be someone else. And if the president is involved in the situation, then perhaps it needs to be someone else. And the decision about who should do it should not just be about who has the responsibility to do it, but also how they fit with whoever the person or people are that might need to be included in the conversation. And that's not something that I can advise on, but in many of the situations where I've talked to people, most of the time people can go, yeah, I think this might be this person's responsibility. No, it's not about whose responsibility it is. It's about who can best manage the conversation. Thanks, Kath. So that's our presentation, so to speak. And very shortly, Kath's going to turn off the presentation and we will be able to engage in conversation with you. But essentially what we've managed to do is in a very short space of time, capture years and years of work. And what we wanted to do was leave it open for a conversation with you. I saw some familiar names and faces in the room, which is great. But it is important that we say at the outset, this is a conversation that we ask you to not name names or name organisations. Yes, okay, somebody might know where you're from and might even think they know who you're talking about. But if we're going to have these sorts of conversations, it needs to be agreed that we might repeat the nature of the story somewhere, but we won't repeat the story and name anybody outside this setting. And I hope you'll all understand that that makes sense in this sort of discussion. So do we have some initial questions? And Rachel, are you going to be the one that fields the questions?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So can people use their raise hand function if you're like me and sometimes can't find it or it doesn't work? Just raise your hand on the screen. The problem with that is I can't see everybody that's on once. So where you can use your hand raising function, that would be fantastic. Does anybody want to kick off the questions? Nicole.
Hi. Okay, so I belong to CRC. We have another organisation that we work closely with, and we've on numerous occasions had some conflicts happening. We've just recently another one, and so there's a particular person who is in another organisation or several other organisations who has held a grudge from many management committees ago, and is the words of this particular person was, I said, well, perhaps we can look at rectifying this situation, and the reply I got was, not while I'm here. So referring to themselves, not to me. So how do you go about changing that? Because it impacts on our organisation and others.
Ooh. Yeah, I'd have to, for me, I'd really like to explore the situation a bit further and the dynamics, but if there is, I did come across a couple of my participants who had to say to a board member, as a CEO, as a board member, it's you or me, mate.
Yeah.
But I understand you're in a different organisation to this person.
Yes. So our paths, the two organisations, or this person is in two other organisations that we deal with as the CRC, and the attitude of this person comes back to impact quite strongly.
Yes. Megan, do you have any ideas?
My thinking in relation to that is quite often the people who refuse to see the negative impact that they are having are the hardest to talk to. Yes. And so sometimes what you actually need to do is be able to find evidence of the negative impact that you can present to them. Now, that's difficult. And sometimes the best person to have the chat with them is an outsider, not a person within the organisation. There are actually some people who do that sort of work, usually for a fee, of course.
Yeah.
But in one organisation that I went into, there was a long-serving person who had been involved in the organisation for many, many years, who could not see that they had racist views about things. And the only way to get them to see was to start to give them a view of what it looks like from the other side, and the damage that was doing to their reputation. So it's a difficult one to answer, Nicole, and I don't envy you, but it is the sort of thing that getting a sense of where they're coming from, it sounds like you've got a sense of the fact that there's a history here, is the place to start.
Yeah, and I would also, I would review the situation from your point of view, like how much is going to hurt you, and protect yourself, and understand that you have reached out and said, let's get past this, and he's saying no. You don't have to keep beating your head against a brick wall, because that's just really hurtful, and perhaps there are ways to go around, for other people to deal directly with him rather than you, or, that's when you look at your networks within your own organisation, say, what support can I get from the other people I work with to deal with this person who has basically a personal grudge against me.
Yes,
because to get the outcomes the organisation needs, you might have to step aside from that role, whatever it was that you have.
Okay, thank you.
And protect yourself, and don't give yourself a hard time, because these people exist. They
do, yes. Yeah, and it's not me personally that this person has an issue with, but it's a couple of things in different organisations they're involved with have had conflict with the CRC and even past management and the rest of it. But obviously this person can't let go of that and brings in and colours everything with those past conflicts.
Yes, very difficult
That's
situation.
in fact sad for them, because it probably means that their jaundiced view of the world is influencing their enjoyment of the organisations as well.
Absolutely, yeah. Yep. Okay, thank you.
This wasn't meant to be an advice session, but there we go, straight.
There you go.
That's all right. These sorts of questions are the sorts of questions that come up in these sessions all the time.
Yes.
Do other people have any questions? Meredith.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Kath and Megan, for the presentations. So I'm from Volunteering WA, and it's certainly an area that we hear a lot from both volunteer organisations as well as volunteers. And I think one of the things that struck me, Kath, and I am sorry for the experience that you had personally, is just how hurtful it is for people. A lot of the time we literally just listen, because I think because of conflicts and different things, they're often left with no one to talk to, because they don't want to betray other people.
Leadership role.
And even volunteers, you know, they don't want to speak ill of someone else, and you know, you get the whole thing, but they often feel very isolated, and our sense is that those hurts can persist for some time. I guess one of the areas that we're aware of is there is a sort of a growing, you know, IR kind of context to this, in the sense of industrial relations in terms of conflict resolution and grievances. I was just wondering if you could comment on the role of formal grievance processes versus informal methods. Just anything that you observed in that, or any insights from either of your experience in that regard.
Yeah, so when I talk about group leadership capacity, I'm talking on a sort of a three-pronged thing, from leaders to the relationships and the networks that you have, and you know, the strength, the trust, the social capital, if you like, and also the structural things like your processes and your constitutions. My observation was that once you go to the point of your constitution, or you go to an outside agency for arbitration or mediation, generally the situation was very well advanced, and it was quite a difficult situation. Sometimes it is the only way for the organisation to reconcile the outcome, and it often does lead to a parting of ways. It's quite unusual for, once you get to that, for at least not to lose a couple of people. But the benefit of it is that the whole community can be involved, or they can at least see that it's been a just and fair process. And you might lose one or two of the, what you might call the ringleaders, or the, you know, the central people in the unhappy faction. You might lose them, but you're very likely to be able to gather the people that supported them back into the organisation, which I think is a really good outcome under those circumstances.
So I think one of the things that I would observe is that we kind of have a two-tiered situation for many organisations in Western Australia, because if it looks like bullying and those sorts of things, then Fair Work legislation actually covers those sorts of situations for some organisations. But if you're an association incorporated in Western Australia and you don't have the same industrial relations set up, but as Kath said, once you go into the formal procedures, you find yourself a long way down the track anyway. The thing that I always come back to is there a way to work out what the superordinate goals are? What is it that both or all of the people involved want? And that's where you can tap into, okay, what is it that these people or this person wants out of the organisation? So back to that mission, task, or people connection. And it is part of the reason that you actually end up with splinter organisations, because they believe in the mission and they can't work out how to get there. But the development of grievance procedures are often the product of history. Yeah. And so if you have a simple grievance procedure and actually it works, but there are bumpy bits in it, then it's a good idea to go back and review the grievance procedure. But if people aren't involved in developing the grievance procedure in the first place, they're not likely to necessarily want to follow it. So a time when things are going well is the time to put their heads together and try and develop a grievance procedure, because if you've developed something that people have generally said, yeah, that sounds like it might work, you've got a better chance of people being willing to follow it than if you do it in response to a negative situation.
Definitely, in response to a negative situation is a dangerous time to do it, because you can really overdo it in the other direction. And keeping that grievance procedure or all your procedures very close to what you actually do is a good idea, because what happens in a schism is people start finding loopholes in constitutions. And if there's a difference between what we generally do and what it says our process says we should do, if there's a gap there, that really opens up a lot of place where people can weaponize different things like your values or your constitution. So yes, keep it up to date all the time is a really good one, I think. And that idea of what's our superordinate goal in a schism, that can get a bit sticky, because everybody thinks that they are doing what's best for the organization. Everybody thinks that. But the other thing that you can look at is what does everyone need in terms of human needs, and if you can meet those needs in other ways. So if you can meet people's needs for self-efficacy or for their identity, as Megan was talking about, showing them respect and recognition, even if it's in another setting and not this particular issue that you're working on, or if you can look at those. It's not just that everybody wants what's best for the organisation, because their picture of that is very different, but everybody wants to feel valued and like they belong. So you can work on those levels as well.
Kit, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I'm curious, like, where your research that you've shared about today, I didn't hear it mentioned, but you might have covered it in different parts, like the issue and challenges of relational trauma and intergenerational trauma. And when there's in a lot of spaces where like relational trauma healing isn't being done well. Yeah, so like there's that part, but also like the same like when we do Welcome to Country and acknowledging the ancestors, when we show up in places, it's not just our physical, we're also showing up with our ancestors in different spaces. So it's that like when healing hasn't happened in different spaces, like I also see that, yeah, there's a connection there that's not being addressed.
Definitely. And there's a big thing around the whole shame and blame and failure thing for me, because people are very reluctant to talk about big conflicts that their group has had. This whole confidentiality and credibility and all that stuff. So it tends to get shoved away and everything's good. And you don't go back and do that healing on a personal level or a group level. And I think that that definitely contributes to schisms down the road as well. I've had people who've told me about 2 schisms 20 years apart, and they said it was the same group of people. They don't go back. We don't talk about it because there's the shame attached to it, I think. I don't know how that relates to, I've got my ideas of how that relates to my personal shame around how we've treated our Aboriginal population here in Australia, but it makes it harder to do that healing, and definitely it's of great benefit. And one of the things that just doing the interviews, everyone said how great it was for me to listen and understand what they were talking about, and then they were able to just take that one more little step in their own healing journey, I think.
I think too, there's a lot of work being done, and I have a lot of learning to do about standing and empathizing. You can't actually stand in someone else's shoes, but you can try and learn as they tell you what their experience is and perhaps what they have understood in relation to their own situation or their ancestors' situation. But Kit, what you raise is a really important topic area that we don't know enough about. And I think organisations taking steps towards reconciliation activities, but also looking at the equality, diversity, inclusion, belonging, those sorts of areas is something that is a big yawning gap in some of the research that's been done in our area. And I think acknowledging that is a place to start as well.
Yeah, I often get news from the Healing Foundation in Australia that are doing great work in that space, but also connected to Thomas Hubel and the collective trauma healing side of things. So like the trauma that we're aware of here in Australia, but also from a collective trauma where it's disconnected. But from a humanity, we've had these unresolved conflicts for like so many generations.
Yeah.
Very important topic. Thank you.
Yes, and the organisation needs to heal itself as well as the people.
The questions, comments people want to throw in? Because actually, Kath, the comment that you just made in terms of the organisational impact is, I've been involved in not-for-profit organisations for a long time, which I'm sure a lot of the people on the webinar have been. And it's the impact also on the broader, basically the trauma caused on the broader organisation as well, and how we address that, acknowledging that even if some of the people in the organisation, not everybody's involved in the schism, but it plays out for everybody in the organisation.
It does, yeah, that's a really good point, because very often the schism occurs in a very tight circle, very carefully controlled circle of people. The most common way was when it was the CEO or the principal with one tight group, and they were keeping it close to try and limit the fallout on kids or clients. And then you've got another group which are carefully recruiting members through just feeling them out, and then all of a sudden it just blows up for everyone, or it just becomes a toxic work situation because no one can talk about it. And yeah, it definitely impacts everyone.
Have you got suggestions then for how to deal with and either mitigate or put in place support for people who are feeling that it's almost the impact, and it's impacting on their social and emotional well-being and their work?
I had, let's say, 5 female principals or CEOs that I spoke to who went into an organisation where a founder or a beloved leader had just left, and somebody in the organisation was expecting to take the job, and they were put into it, and they were outstanding leaders, but boy, they went through a couple of years of hell with various things going on. I forgot what the question was now. What can we put in place to
help the others heal?
One of the really things that stood out was those who coped the best with that very isolated situation of being the leader in that situation was those who had outside mentors. Because you can't talk, they were adamant, you cannot talk about this in the organisation, not to a single person. And one of them had her senior executive team. She had one person in there who looked at her and said, wow, this person's really good. And the rest of them rallied around the person that thought that should have got the job. So she had him, and she had her partner who was also a CEO, so could understand. She had a mentor, and she also had a consultant. So she had that outside support. But the leader in that situation gets incredibly isolated. And I can tell you right now, they are all thinking of leaving.
So the thing that I always suggest when I'm running workshops for volunteer managers is, in fact, the greatest strength and the greatest asset that they have is each other, and that I encourage them, even though they are crossing different organisations, to get to know one another a little bit, to be able to contact each other, and to have someone that they can pick up the phone to and say, I need you to listen to this. You don't have to name names or anything like that, but just often talking it through with someone who might have some understanding of what it is can actually be a useful tool. Often verbalizing it either makes you recognize actually it's not as big as it first feels like emotionally, but also there are steps through, but also just feeling like somebody else is there. And the volunteer managers through events like this, so not just volunteer managers, but people in these sorts of situations actually getting together and comparing notes about things is often a useful way. So that network of support is good. But the other thing about that is that actually people who are not central to whatever the situation is, but are around outside, also need to be able to talk to other people. So it's about having a bit of an opportunity to express it. And sometimes you can offer people the opportunity, go and write it down without any names and send it to yourself, or that sort of thing, to try and get rid of some of it. But it is a very difficult situation, and being the leader that's trying to support the people who are in the situation and outside the situation can be really challenging. I agree.
Yeah. Somebody's written in the chat, what is the wisdom of knowing when to jump? I think that's a really good one. When it hurts too much. When you're not, when you're in it, you're so immersed in it. You're so, this organization is going to fall apart if I don't fight for this. And then if you just turn around and look at it from the other direction, does it matter if this organization falls apart? In the grand scheme of things, is the sky going to fall down if this organization stops tomorrow? Yes, it will be bad, but is it worth my health, my well-being, my heart? I had 2 men I interviewed who ended up in hospital, collapsed at work. Don't let it get that far.
It's just put in the comments, none of us are indispensable. I think that's a really important thing to remember, despite the fact that we would like to feel indispensable at times.
Yeah. And you do feel indispensable because you've got people around you going, we can't let them get away with this, and you've got people saying, you're right about this, we need you. And then you've just got to think they're going to be okay. The school that I left, it's going great now. They're fine. The organization will survive. It's you. Take care of yourself. Just consider that I could leave. I could leave. Rather than I have to leave. I got no choice but to leave. It's like I'm choosing to leave because I don't need this.
Can I ask a question there? Have you found where a situation where in fact somebody has left and that has either resolved the situation or it's just continued on without them?
Mostly it resolves the situation when one person leaves because that power struggle is dissipated. It might not necessarily resolve things long term if the healing doesn't happen, if the improvements to your structure and the way that you run things doesn't happen. If you don't learn from it, you can carry on. So one of the findings in the literature, one of the only quantitative findings, is that previous schism is an indicator of a future schism.
Did you say previous schism is an indicator? Right.
Yeah.
And has the literature then looked at where if the schism has been successfully resolved, then you still get further schisms, or a successful resolution really helps the health of the organisation in the longer term?
I personally think from what I've seen, it depends, because there are organisations where you've got a couple of difficult people or a bad situation going on, but people are so attached to that identity that they have, and they just have to go, and sadly it has to happen. but you've also got situations, let's say activist organizations, for example, where a split is a good thing. In Czechoslovakia, there was an environmental organization. One faction wanted to go off and do direct action. The other one wanted to lobby the government. They couldn't do both because one was not doing one, made the other not credible. And so they split, and it actually was a good thing. But one of my findings was that the more you share power, so the closer the balance of power is between all the people in the organization, the easier it is to shift into that contest situation. So the easier it is to contest for power. If you don't like what's happening, then the more likely your organization is to schism. So if by your values, you want to share power and you want to organize as a shared democratic organization, then you're going to risk having a schism by sticking with your values like that. So you're more likely to have a schism than somebody that restructures everything and just lets the CEO make all the decisions. If that makes sense.
So the other part of that, however, is that there's a lot of research that says robust debate is actually good for the organisation. And if you can have robust and respectful debate, then you can actually air things before they become difficult.
Yes.
And the one thing that I would like to observe relating to the founders of organisations is that sometimes founders of organisations stay so long and hold on so tight that when they leave, the organisation doesn't survive. But if they can be enlightened enough to say, it's time for me to move on because the organisation needs to grow and change, but it needs to do that without me, that in fact they can be setting up a very successful organisation and it will keep going. And I know of a very successful aged care organisation here in Western Australia where that is exactly what has happened on a couple of occasions, where the founders have moved on and their long-term CEO has moved on and the organisation has managed to keep going and to survive and grow and thrive, whereas other aged care organisations in very similar situation have gone down the path of someone definitely wants to talk to me, have gone down the path of the founder has held on so tight that after they've gone, there was not enough knowledge across the organisation to help it survive. This person had held on to everything so tightly. So,
there's too much loyalty for that person or whatever. Yeah. My research did show that sometimes you get the organisation suffers then or has a schism and sometimes they don't. So it's not the actual what the founder did or this person doing that. It's more a matter of what the situation is, how people respond to it, how they interpret it, how they manage, but that whole idea of, as Megan said, if all the leadership is in one person, you lose them, then your group leadership capacity is devastated.
Anybody else have any questions? Doesn't look like it. So thank you, Katherine, for insightful and thoughtful. Thanks to ACOS for. Okay, so I was just checking that wasn't a question. So thank you so much for your time this afternoon. As you can probably see from the chat comments, you've had a lot of very positive comments, and thank you for an informative session. Your slides, are we able to share your slides if you share them with us? Is that okay?
That's okay with me.
Yes, Kath, if you just forward the file to.
Yeah, I'll just take the notes
Dylan
out.
That we've been corresponding with.
Yeah, fair enough. Take out your slide notes. Yep. Thank you.
I'll fix that typo I saw as well.
I didn't see it, so.
It was just a space, a missing space.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks, Dylan, too, for holding our events.
Thank you hugely for the time and effort you've put in and kindly sharing your expertise with us. As you can tell from the comments, it's very much appreciated. And for the people still on the webinar, we're going to be holding at least one a month on different issues, hopefully from now until at least the new year. So stay tuned. We'll be sending out that information and emerging issues. You will be getting notification of emerging issues. The webinar that we usually have earlier in the year but was delayed, of course, because of our conference. There'll be notifications coming out about that shortly. So stay tuned. Thank you again, once again, Megan and Katherine, for your time this afternoon.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.